Dear listener, has this podcast helped you in your daily life? Has your thinking changed about your understanding of trauma, stress, and living an authentic life? Did it help you grow inner strengths, become a calmer and happier parent? Did it help you become more aware of your conscious patterns, understand your needs, and improve your communication? Did it teach you tools and skills for managing stress, regulating your nervous system, and increasing well-being? Show your love and support today by making a donation. Your contribution in any amount makes a huge difference. It reflects the spirit of our community and what the show stands for. I am asking for your help as I really want to maintain the show's independence and integrity, provide you with enjoyable listening experience, free from disruptions and intrusive ads, and create a self-sustaining, a fully listener-supported show. Your support is invaluable as it will enable us to sustain the show, bringing you new episodes on a weekly basis without interruptions. A lot of invisible work goes into producing a high-quality podcast. There are 3 phases: pre-production, production, and post-production, all costly and time-consuming. Besides conducting interviews, countless hours of research, planning, coordinating, scheduling, and preparing goes into creating each episode. Plus, there are editing and hosting fees. I love making the podcast. It enriches my life beyond words, and I absolutely love our strong global community. Especially when I hear my awesome listeners say things like, "Your podcast deserves more than 5 stars. Thank you, Anna, from the bottom of my heart for the amazing insights you share with the world. I can't tell you how many times I have cried listening to your podcast and feeling a connection to everything being said. Thank you." Or, "This show has been a life changer for me. It has pushed me to grow as an individual and learn how to help my daughter grow. Because of what I've learned, so many of the relationships in my life have flourished, including the one with myself. Although I know I still have room to grow, I know this podcast will provide me with the tools and resources to do so." If you too have enjoyed the podcast and witnessed its value in your life, show your love and support today. Go to authenticparenting.com/support and make a donation. We also have a Patreon page. However, a large chunk of your contribution when you become a patron gets cut off by them. So, ideally, I would encourage you to make a donation through my website, which is authenticparenting.com/support. My deepest gratitude to those of you who have been supporting the show on Patreon over the years. We have 21 active members, and I will always appreciate your kindness and generosity. Thank you. I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about growing ourselves while raising our children. I'm a psychologist, educator, and parent coach. And on this podcast, I explore how you can connect to your authentic self, practice radical self-care, and raise emotionally healthy children. Let's break the generational cycle of trauma for a more peaceful, kind, and compassionate world. Today, how to become more resilient. Do you ever wonder what makes some people able to navigate trauma, adversity, life's difficult situations more effectively than others? Are some people naturally more resilient than others, or can it be learned? What is true resilience? How do you measure a person's resiliency? Can we teach our children how to be more resilient? This is the topic of exploration today with my special guest, Jonathan DePierro. He is an Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and Associate Director of Mount Sinai's Center for Stress, Resilience, and Personal Growth. Dr. DePierro is a clinical psychologist, an expert in psychological resilience and the treatment of trauma-related mental health conditions. He is the co-author of the third edition of Resilience, the Science of Mastering Life's Greatest Challenges. After many years of working with the individuals impacted by the 9/11 terrorist attacks, he now focuses on supporting the mental health needs of healthcare workers. Having experienced extensive bullying throughout his childhood, he learned important lessons about resilience that continue to inform his clinical and research work. It turns out there are 10 resilience factors. Those who exhibit resilience lean on one or more of the following practices. Number 1, resilient people confront their fears. Number 2, they maintain an optimistic but realistic outlook. Number 3, they seek, accept, and provide social support. Number 4, they imitate role models. Number 5, they rely on an inner moral compass. Number 6, they turn to religious and spiritual practices. Number 7, they attend to their health and well-being. Number 8, they remain curious, pushing themselves to learn new things. Number 9, they approach problems with flexibility and at times acceptance. And number 10, they find meaning and growth during and after their traumatic experience. Resilience is not something either you have it or not. It's something that unfolds over time, occurs in a context, and often involves growth. Please enjoy. Jonathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited to talk to you about resilience, which is one of my favorite topics. I think a good place for us to start would be a definition, right? What is your favorite definition of resilience?
So my working definition of resilience is someone's ability to adapt, grow, and recover from life's challenges, big and small.
That's nice. But it seems like everybody can fall into that category. When I was younger, and you write this in your book too, on page 21, it says, when we began to study resilience 30 years ago, we assumed that highly resilient people were somehow special, even genetically gifted. We assumed that resilience was rare, reserved for select group of unique individuals. So I really want you to talk about maybe misconceptions about resilience. What do people get right about resilience, and what do people misunderstand what resilience is? In that definition, when you give that definition, it feels like we all go through challenges and we adapt. But I guess the growth part is maybe what differentiates most of us from one another.
Yes, that's part of it. I think that one thing that's really important to understand about resilience in the way that we think about it is there are challenging things that happen in the world. There are significant traumas that people go through, life-threatening events. There's emotional abuse, racism, and discrimination. And that leaves lasting impact. Those things have an emotional impact. For some people, that means the development of post-traumatic stress disorder or depression or anxiety. And for others, they develop some distress, but never a full diagnosis. But what I want people to understand the most is that across the broad range of emotional impacts of stress, there is a lot of room for growth, resilience, strength. Some of this, right, has a genetic component. We all know people who seem to be able to withstand anything, get right back up and keep ticking, and their parents and grandparents might be the same. But there's a lot that can be learned through experience, of having a role model, of having a good therapist, and of reading about people's experiences, thinking about what resources are out there to support me. Now, certainly, when we think about resilience, we often think about too, not only someone's capacity to tolerate stress innately, we think about what they can learn, and we also think about what community resources are available to them. And that differs depending on where you are. Some places, it's really easy to find a therapist. Your employer might provide one, like we do at Mount Sinai, at our medical center. But in other places, the therapist that has availability might be 100 miles away or in another state, and you might not be able to see them. Or you might not have a family or support network that can support your resilience. So we really need to think about the different layers of resilience. It's not just that it lives in the individual, it's the individual in context.
It's the individual in context. I was speaking with someone who was part of the Boston Marathon shooting, who went through that experience. And she said to me that she didn't feel that she was resilient right after the event because she saw that some people were coping right after the event very well, and she found herself not being able to cope. And to me, that's not really a defining component of resilience. Yes, you might be resilient, but not at that moment, right? Can you speak about that? I think people misunderstand that as well. They think like, if I'm not coping right now very well, then I might not be a resilient person.
Right. There are a range of responses to trauma and loss, some of which are impairing, some of which are manageable. And I think this is maybe one of the limitations of our field. Resilience is a difficult concept to define. And because it's a difficult concept to define, it's a difficult concept to measure. If you can't define what a thing is, you can't measure it very well and effectively. So one of the research shortcuts that we've used is to say, here's a group of 1,000 people that have been through a traumatic event or more than one traumatic event. And here's what percent of them develop PTSD a year out or 2 or 3 years out. Those groups have a clinical diagnosis. And then there's another group, most people, who don't develop PTSD a year or 2 or 3 out. And researchers have called that group resilient because they have an exposure, something that could lead to a diagnosis like PTSD, or at least to stress related to that, and they don't develop PTSD. So they're resilient to the development of this illness. That's really limiting because it doesn't take into consideration the natural course of recovery. Some people develop symptoms very early on that remit pretty quickly. It doesn't take into consideration how people can recover and the resources that they can gain over time with therapy, for example, or with their own meaning-making process, maybe with their faith, embracing their community. And I think the take-home message for me in all of this is people with diagnoses, people struggling with depression, anxiety, PTSD, it's not that they're not resilient. It's very important to understand how they are resilient in addition to having the distress and the suffering, because those are the processes that people use to heal. Even people with depression might have religious practices. They might have a social community. They might have a little bit of optimism, but all of those things can be harnessed and cultivated and enhanced to enhance recovery. So there's growth and distress go together, and I can talk about that more later, but it's really important to know that if you're out there and you've been struggling with mental health symptoms, it doesn't mean that you're not resilient. I think that those labels get us into trouble in psychiatry.
Yeah, that's so true. So there are several points that I want to read from the book, and maybe you can comment on them. So you say here are a few important points about resilience to keep in mind while you are reading this book. So number one is resilient people have faced challenges. You cannot say a person is resilient unless they have had challenges thrown their way. They must be resilient to, from, or following some stressful or traumatic event. I think you spoke about that. So you cannot exercise resiliency unless there is a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about it this way. One of the things that I think about a lot is I'm an academic. I read a lot of papers and I read a lot of books. I read about exercise. I know intellectually it's good for me, but I don't know that it's helpful for my stress until I face some stress. And then I have that real world experience to show its benefits. And I think there's a difference between intellectually doing something or even for example, people who have a meditation or yoga or exercise practice. There are people that do that under the best of circumstances when they're feeling at their best. And when something pretty terrible or stressful happens, they stop and they don't do it anymore. And it takes them a really long time to recover from it. And then those are just hypothetical helpful things for them. They're not actually helpful because they've stopped doing them. The people that I'm really interested in are the folks that have these practices, encounter stress and keep at it, and actually use those skills to harness their recovery when they do those things, even in the toughest of moments. So many years ago, my colleague, our dean of the medical school, our co-author, Dennis Charney, interviewed Vietnam War POWs with our colleague, Steve Southwick. And these, mostly men, they're actually all men, were in POW camps in Hanoi Hilton in Vietnam for 6 years, up to 6 years. And they were in solitary confinement. And there's a difference between the camaraderie and unit cohesion and communication that they had when they were in their boot camp and in their training to become officers, and what they did when they were in solitary confinement. So when the rubber hit the road, they actually made their own communication system by tapping on their cell walls or on the pipes, what they called the tap code, to foster that communication. They could have, kept isolated, not communicated, not connected to each other, but they saw that it was vital for their survival. So when the rubber hit the road, they still did it. And I think that's really important, that to think about, even in the worst of circumstances, you have a choice of how you face it.
But unfortunately, not everybody feels that way, right? There are some people who really don't feel that resourcefulness or choicefulness or tap into that sense of, yes, I can do something about this. They feel disempowered. I've always been fascinated by this. Like, how come some people in the same given circumstances, when I was 13, my listeners probably are so tired of me saying this, but you don't know my story, and I'm not going to go into detail, but I experienced a severe earthquake in Armenia in 1988. And so on a massive scale, I witnessed what was happening and how people were coping, right? Even kids in my school, there were kids who committed suicide. We all had the same circumstances. We all lost parents, our homes, and things like that. And some people were very resilient and some people weren't. Adults, kids, like I was always observing and watching, and always this question was in my mind, like, why are some people are resourceful and can exercise that sense of choice and some people cannot? So can you say about the person who doesn't feel so empowered in those moments, can they learn and train to become more resilient? And when do they have to do that training? I mean, what can they do during the hardship or after? Do they have to do the work afterwards, or when do they have to do that work?
Yeah, so ideally, this goes back to your earlier question. Ideally, people would put in place like a survival strategy. Not to say that we never know when an earthquake is coming or when a car accident or a traumatic loss is coming, but the more in calm times, you can put together a toolkit for yourself of, okay, I have this social network. I have this maybe exercise routine. At least I'm moving my body a little bit. I have a little bit of optimism that I try to cultivate. I have a sense of purpose in my life. I'm trying to think flexibly about the situations that I'm in. The more you practice those things before you need them, the most helpful it's going to be. So the analogy from medicine is, when a patient stops breathing or loses their heartbeat, we call that a code. And medical professionals, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, practice running the code well before they have a real patient in front of them who is dying, so that they know by second nature what these skills are. They don't even have to go through a mental checklist. It's like in their DNA almost. And so the most important thing that I can impart to people is that it's so much more challenging in the midst of a crisis to learn these things. And we learned that during the pandemic too. It's much easier to, when things are relatively calm, in relative for each person, to put some of these things in place intentionally so that when you need them, they're there. And when you need them, they're second nature, and it becomes really, really hard to not do them. They're baked into your life.
Yeah, that makes sense. So let's go to the second point. Resilience unfolds over time. How someone is coping immediately after a traumatic or stressful event may not tell you very much at all about their resilience, because it's a process that unfolds over days, weeks, months, and years. This speaks to the point that I made earlier. Do you want to say anything about this, or should we move to the point number 3?
What I would say about this, it in fact goes back to your earlier question. There are lots of folks after a traumatic event, and this is where we have to be careful about how we use language. So in social media, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, gets thrown around a lot as a catch-all label for reactions to traumatic situations. What we know from the research is that most people, for days, even a few weeks afterwards, after a life-threatening, life-changing traumatic situation, experience a change in functioning. They're upset. They're reliving it over and over again. They might have disturbed sleep. They might have irritability. And so it's important not to throw a label of PTSD on that right away, because we know most people recover from that experience and get back to kind of like what their baseline is over some time. So I think there's a popular culture urge to say, I'm upset after a loss for a few weeks or a month, I've got PTSD. But that's not exactly always true. In fact, there's 20 symptoms of PTSD, and people have to have a constellation of different symptoms to meet criteria. But the other point I'll make is that there are plenty of people who even develop PTSD or depression after a trauma and recover. Now, that means that definitionally, they might not have been resilient at year one, but they get to an endpoint where they're functioning better. They're maybe using skills, using resources. So to categorically, rubber stamp their folder to say in red ink, not resilient, is problematic because it doesn't give credit to the human capacity to recover and grow.
Yeah, I love that point. Yes, I really like that point. Not categorically stamping someone resilient or not. I think most people, we sort of think like that about resilience. Some people even say, I'm not that resilient, or another person may say, I'm very resilient, right? We even speak like that. Yeah. So point number 3 is feeling distress does not mean someone is not resilient. Resilient people may experience psychological symptoms such as depression, recurring upsetting memories, or intense self-blaming following traumatic events, which while still carrying on with important facets of their lives. Resilience can also be seen in the process of recovery from medical or mental conditions. I think you already spoke about this. I love this point. Number 4 is resilience often involves growth. Often people who go through challenging life events say they have grown in some way as a person and have a greater sense of personal meaning in life. This change, like many in life, can come after or during significant emotional pain. Yeah, that's definitely, I've experienced that. Can you say a few words about the growth part?
Sure. So this idea of post-traumatic growth, let me define it a little bit for the listeners. So post-traumatic growth is a concept that has been around for about 20 years or so. And it's our understanding that sometime after a traumatic event, or even for some during, there can be positive changes that occur. Positive changes like you have a new sense of your own personal strength. Like, I got through hell and I survived it. I don't know how I did it, but I guess I'm tougher than I thought I was. A new sense of personal connections. So we saw our healthcare workers working on these floors in the worst of the pandemic, and they built stronger relationships with each other. They had bonds that were formed in those trenches. And we see that in soldiers too, those bonds that are so hard to break. So they have no new social connections. They might have a new sense of what's really important to them in their life. They went through a difficult situation and it reoriented their compass about what their priorities are. They might have a new spiritual sense or a reinvigorated spiritual sense, that closer to a personal God or a spiritual community. So all of those things are fairly common. Actually, what we found is in our frontline healthcare workers at Mount Sinai, our research shows that 80% endorsed one or more of those different dimensions of post-traumatic growth. But I want to say something else that's very, very important, which is we also looked at their levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms and levels of distress. And what we found is that those, and other research finds this as well, those healthcare workers that have PTSD symptoms actually had the most post-traumatic growth. And so what this tells us, and again, research of soldiers, other populations tells us the same thing, is that distress and growth go together. And often it goes together in complicated ways. Other research has shown that it's actually those people with moderate PTSD symptoms that have the most growth. So you can imagine a hill in your mind where people with low post-traumatic stress symptoms have a little bit of growth, not a lot. People with moderate PTSD symptoms have a whole lot of growth. And people with very severe symptoms, maybe because they're so impaired and preoccupied by them, can't reflect on how their life might have changed in a positive way. Or maybe they're so thrown off by those symptoms they can't even get out of bed or interact with folks. But there is a real relationship between distress and growth. And some people even think that distress drives the growth. Like you have to think about, who am I now? What I just go through? How did it impact me? What's my new normal? All of those things, the process of meaning making opens the capacity for growth. And I think that's really important for people to think about. We're not sugarcoating a traumatic situation. Sometimes it's called the silver lining. I think that maybe that's too positive because it comes with distress. It is not fantastic feeling.
Yeah, you know what I'm thinking? I've been thinking this while I was reading the book. I've been thinking that about our children. I was conversing with my neighbor, with my friend about this, that our children's lives are predominantly okay. You know, they have a roof, they have loving parents, they have food, they have access to resources, they have the internet, they have a lot of good things. And that's not the case for everyone, obviously. But, you know, in this Western modern world, we do have a good life. Even if you are disadvantaged, it's still better than in the third world countries or like the conditions that I experienced. You know, no food, no clothes, no heat. You know, like I've experienced extreme, life conditions. And so I often think, how is my child or children like my child going to develop resiliency if there is no significant distress in their life? Because life is predominantly comfortable. Amazon ships overnight, their life is different. Do you know what I mean? So does that mean our children are not going to be as resilient? Does it mean as time goes on, when they encounter something later in their life, they're going to crumble and fall apart and, they're not going to have this repertoire of coping skills because their life was quote unquote easy, comfortable, less distress. I often think about this. What can you say to that? I don't want to artificially manufacture problems, but I also worry about the opposite side of it, that too much comfort, luxury, no distress is going to have an adverse impact on our kids, no?
I was actually just watching a YouTube video. We've interviewed a lot of military folks. So I was watching a YouTube video of a boot camp, a military boot camp. And one of the instructors yelled at these new cadets saying, get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I thought of that as you were talking. My colleague, Dr. Dennis Charney, who is my co-author, has children. And he told me that one of the things that he learned is an effective parenting strategy is to push them to do things that are outside their comfort zone, that aren't too dangerous, but have the possibility of failure. And that builds up a capacity to tolerate discomfort, to tolerate the lack of immediate gratification. For example, team sports. In team sports, you could exert a lot of effort, and it does push you to learn some resilient skills, like thinking on the fly, thinking flexibly, managing your anger and frustration, which I think a lot of kids struggle with, working together, communicating. All of those things are resilient skills. So there's a lot of benefit to team sports in that it is physically strenuous, it can be emotionally strenuous, and it is preparatory for many of the challenges in life. I went to a all-boys Jesuit military high school in New York City called Xavier High School. It was a college preparatory school. That's what they call it. It prepared me for life, not just college, but for life, with a routine, with a schedule, with accountability, owning up to your mistakes, owning up to your part in being on a team, having to be on time for things, being, having, everything you need for the day and prepared ahead of time. All of those things help me. And I think the most important lesson I would say and want to convey to your listeners is don't be afraid of challenging your children. A little having them learn to tolerate the discomforts that come along with aspects of life. And you can do that through things like team sports or individual sports or activities where success is not guaranteed. And I think, I've spoken a lot with Dean Charney about sports where everybody gets a prize. There's a benefit to everybody feeling good, but the downside is that you don't learn to tolerate not coming in first.
Yeah, I agree about the sports. I do agree about the sports. But it seems like, yeah, if everyone is getting a trophy, participation medals, or things of this nature, that defeats the purpose, right? Our tolerance for discomfort is very low. I feel like in this developed Western world, even, when the temperature gets a little cold or too hot inside, there's air conditioning. There's all these solutions externally to our even external discomfort, let alone the psychological, right? There's always solutions, but I worry about this question a lot. So, okay, I'm going to go to the next point. Resilience can differ across the lifespan. One way of thinking or acting might be more helpful at one point in someone's life, but not at another. Think about the child who has no one to turn to in their life. They need to be self-sufficient and scrappy to survive and thrive. But when they get older and have more people around them who care for them, reaching out and asking for help in tough times would be a marker of personal resilience. I like this point, that it grows across lifespan.
And it's another indication that it's about the context. There are certain things that people do to adapt to difficult situations when they have no other choice. But when the situation changes, often their behavior has to change too. And I know from the clinical work that I do that that's not always the case. Some people take these adaptations that they use to survive in childhood and adolescence and bring them into their adult life, when in their adult life, they're no longer face those harsh circumstances, but treat the world as if they are going through those harsh circumstances, as if they have to be a one-person show, that they can't trust other people, they can't reach out, they have to be fiercely independent. Those things were probably helpful at a place and a time, but are likely no longer serving them in the present situation, and they sort of play the same tape over and over again. That's all they know. It makes sense. It helped them. Why wouldn't it help them now? Because the situation is different.
Let's talk about the 10 resilience markers. You have interviewed a lot of individuals for this book, and you distilled down to 10 markers, factors for resilience. Do you want to go over them very quickly, and then we can talk about a few of them a little in depth?
Sure. So some of the factors that we think about are optimism. So having a little bit of a sense that you are in control in your life, that the future can be positive, that you are going through challenges now that will end eventually, some sense of hope there, facing your fears. And this goes into how to raise resilient children, helping them to face their fears head on rather than avoid fearful and scary situations and just do the easy thing. Social support, so having people that you can lean on in your life, and giving support to other people, being altruistic, actually benefits your personal well-being. There's growing research. Actually, our colleague Steve Southwick was involved in research in this right before he passed away. Emotional flexibility. So having a range of different emotions and having different strategies in mind, not just one strategy, different strategies in mind to manage your difficult emotions, to think about contexts where displaying your emotions are appropriate and helpful and others where they might not be. Cognitive flexibility. So thinking about challenges that you face in lots of different ways. I'm a clinical psychologist, and I practice a type of therapy called cognitive therapy. And in cognitive therapy, we teach our patients to look at their thoughts that pop into their mind under the microscope and say to themselves, is this a helpful thought? And is this a realistic thought? Because oftentimes we have plenty of thoughts, like kicking ourselves kind of negative thoughts that are neither helpful or realistic. So thinking flexibly, cognitive flexibility means putting those thoughts under the microscope and thinking about our challenges in a different way, in a way that is not sugarcoating it, but a way that's more helpful in helping us survive the moment than just thinking how horrible it is and that we'll never survive it and that our life is over. Physical exercise is another key component of resilience. So moving your body just a little bit. I know there's many, many, many books written about exercise routines. There's a million different exercise routines you can do. I'm not a physical therapist or a personal trainer, so I can't make a recommendation. All I can say is move your body somehow. You don't need a lot of gym equipment. If it's medically safe to do so, you could lift cans of prunes in your living room when you're sitting on the couch. But doing something is so much better than doing nothing physically. Meaning and purpose is another one. So having a sense of what, why, or what for in your life, a mission. People who have that sense of purpose and mission can go through a whole hell of a lot in the name of that mission. For example, there is a huge sense of meaning and purpose at Mount Sinai, as with other hospitals during that first wave of the pandemic, where essentially our entire medical enterprise was taking care of patients with COVID, and many were dying, and they were doing the best they could. And our entire research enterprise stopped whatever they were doing before and pivoted to trying to discover new novel treatments and novel ways of detecting the virus and taking care of patients. So that became the mission. Whatever the mission was before, that became the mission. And it was, there were a lot of discoveries and patients saved because everybody had a singular mission at that point. Everybody was goal-oriented to one singular goal. Spirituality and religion is very important to many people. And there's a distinction between connecting to something greater, a sense of connection to something greater, which is one way to think about spirituality, and religion, which is a formal set of practices that might involve going to a church or a mosque or a temple. And this is a huge part of people's lives. And I think that in medicine in particular, there isn't a lot of acknowledgement or enough acknowledgement of how crucial and critical this is to people's personal and community resilience. We actually did a recent program at Mount Sinai where we trained community health workers and pastors in different churches in Harlem and other parts of New York City, like Brooklyn and the Bronx, to do workshops around resilience and around physical and mental health more broadly with their congregants. And that was pretty successful, using spirituality as a basis for this conversation. And really those are many of the ones that come top of mind to me as most important. And I think some other things that are woven through that I hope the reader walks away with is the sense that love is incredibly important and motivating. And I think from our last chapter, which is the words of our late colleague, Steve Southwick, love is the most important resilience factor for him. And he showed a lot of love in his final days and weeks.
What's the difference between stress management and resilience? Like all the things that you are mentioning, right? Exercise, cognitive flexibility, and all of those things are good for stress management, right? So can you speak about the difference between stress management and resilience? Or is it better stress management eventually yields to resilience?
Yeah, that's one way to think about it. When I think about stress management, I kind of see it as like a throwaway term, a bucket category. And the bucket usually includes things that people do to manage stress, like eating properly, sleeping properly. So hundreds of books about that, many books about mindfulness, many books about things like yoga or spiritual practices. But that's, in our understanding of resilience, but one aspect. But typically when you think about stress management, that's essentially what people put in that bucket. So I think resilience is much more than a set of those 3 or 4 practices that typically fall under stress management. When I talk about these resilience factors, I'm thinking about a wider range of things, such as a spiritual connection, a social network, having a purpose in life. All of those things are often not included when people talk about stress management. And I think stress management can often be thrown around as a Band-Aid when things get tough. Stress management strategies are offered, but I do think that having a more longstanding practice, especially before a stressful situation and not just reacting to it by throwing Band-Aids at it, is much more productive.
I see. So when you interviewed individuals for the book, were all 10 markers present in all of them?
No. So for some people, they really embodied and leaned on 1 or 2 factors. So there were folks that we talk about in our physical fitness chapter, talking about exercise, where that's a huge part of their identity. My colleague, Dr. Charney, that's a huge part of his identity, talks openly about that. For me personally, that is a small but growing part of my identity. I exercise just a little bit, and others exercise a whole lot and use that as a coping strategy under stress. There are folks, and including the POWs that we interviewed, that their faith, their religious faith, was a huge part of their ability to psychologically survive being in the POW camp. Others who were not religious, who were atheists, tried to emulate some of those practices, and it just didn't work. Like, it didn't work for them because they were faking it. They were trying to fake it till they made it, and it just wasn't part of their repertoire. It didn't feel effective to them. So what we're saying is that no, probably doing a little bit of things, having a wide-ranging repertoire is probably helpful, but you don't have to do all 10 at 100% to be resilient. People have different roads to resilience. Actually, our podcast at Mount Sinai is called Road to Resilience.
Oh, I see. Let's talk about some of the factors. And I'm going to throw at you the one that was of interest to me, which is relied on an inner moral compass. Can you speak about that, and how can we develop an inner compass? Is it some people have it, some people don't? Is this we can cultivate? Is this something we can cultivate?
Right. So it is something that we can cultivate. For some people, their religious faith gives them a moral compass. For others, like some of the POWs that we interviewed in the book, philosophy gave them a moral compass, reading the Greek philosophers. And so in difficult times, they leaned on Stoic philosophy as giving them a guidepost. In the military, they have the code of military justice. They have a set of principles of things that you don't violate. And having that in mind can help be a comparison point when you're going through something difficult. If you don't have a moral guidepost, you might feel at sea. What's the right thing to do? What are my core values? How can I lean on my values to help me figure out what's right and wrong in this situation? And it helps kind of join societies together. And, I think arguably these days of so much political fractiousness in this country, in particular in other countries, there can feel like there's a disintegration of a moral compass. You can't even count on your neighbor to have your back at times. And I think having a common language among even a small group of people can be very helpful in helping them get through something of what defines us and what will we not compromise.
Okay. Another one is changing your mind. I really want to ask you about this, and what are some ways we can do that? I'm really interested in the practical aspect of this.
Yeah, so as I was alluding to earlier, one of the ways that you can think about changing your mind is not taking the thoughts and feelings that you have in a moment at face value, taking them as, the expression is, gospel truth, putting those thoughts and feelings under the microscope and saying, okay, I got a performance evaluation at work. It was 3 pages of positive things. There was 1 sentence of critical comments. And now I think I'm a horrible employee. I'm terrible at my job and I'm going to get fired. The fact is, it was mostly positive and negative. But my automatic thought is it was horrific. Everybody hates me. I'm incompetent. And so the most productive thing that I could do is to put that thought under the microscope, check the facts. Okay, what's the evidence for and against this judgment I'm having about myself? What is a more helpful and productive thought to have? Am I making a whole lot of assumptions based on very little evidence? When I have a center at Sinai where we take care of healthcare workers, including scientists, and this is kind of the scientific method applied to the brain. We conduct an experiment, we check the facts, and do our facts that we're collecting line up with our thoughts or assumptions about how the world works? And I think that is something that can be really, really important. It's hard to do, especially for someone who's in the depths of depression or anxiety or PTSD. And in those circumstances, it's probably best done in collaboration with a therapist. Not to say they can't do it partly by themselves, but it can often be helpful in those circumstances when people are struggling for a long time with mental health symptoms to have someone who's a third-party observer who can present some of this evidence to the contrary and helpful alternative suggestions when you might be so stuck that you can't think for yourself in that moment. You can't think your way out of it. But there are plenty of ways that this is helpful. For example, I was just teaching some medical residents yesterday, and we were talking about this idea of perfectionism. So the automatic thought that pops into their heads and mine at times of if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it at all. Or if I don't do it perfectly, I'm a failure. And so that's not a very helpful thought because it sets you up to kick yourself most of the time. And it can be demotivating. It can be exhausting. It can lead to burnout, which we think about a lot in medicine. And because it's not a helpful thought, we might want to think about loosening it up a little bit, allowing for some flexibility there of, I'm going to mess up sometimes. And our dean, our co-author, Dr. Charney, often talks to people about failure in science. He says, if you're not failing, you're not doing it right. Because you should be taking risks. You should be trying new things. And a lot of those things are not going to work. That's okay. That doesn't mean you're a personal failure and should hang up your microscope and never do science again. That means you're actually pushing the envelope. So that's a reframe of some of those perfectionistic thoughts.
So that there is that saying, don't believe everything you think. You shouldn't.
Yes, that's true. You shouldn't. Because often when we are struggling with some symptoms of depression or self-doubt or anxiety, the common description is to describe those feelings as a lens through which we see the world. We're filtering everything that's happening to us through that depressed, anxious, self-doubting lens. And then we get all of these thoughts floating in our head that have no real evidence or very little and very unconvincing evidence. So this has been described, I use this analogy in the therapy that I do, as having a very active prosecutor voice. Like if your brain is a courtroom, you have a very active, aggressive prosecutor, and your defense attorney is asleep at the desk, not objecting at all, not raising their hand to object. And so one way to think about what goes on in the brains of someone with depression, metaphorically, is that they have a very active prosecutor voice. And they need to poke and wake up their defense attorney.
Yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. If someone is listening and has a question, how do I know if I'm a resilient person? What would you say? Like where to look for evidence to convince yourself that you are indeed a resilient person?
One thing to think about is what are some things that make you you? And I think this is where some people with, say, depression, for example, struggle. They think that they're all bad, but often they're working, they're living, they're breathing, they have family, some of which they speak to, some of which they might not. They might have children. There are some things that are going well. And we can see resilience in the strength of waking up each day and surviving to the next day, right? There's a lot of resilience we see in even just basically in people who survive natural disasters. They make use of resources that are provided to them. They start their life over. And even if it is really a huge struggle, there's strength to be found. And there's strength to be found in every person on the planet. And I think in medicine, by nature of how our structure is built, we talk about the first thing on the chart is presenting problem. What's wrong? Why are you here? Not what's going well. And I think that's an interesting pivot to think about or to hold in balance of what's going well and what are you struggling with? Because if we think about just the problems, people define themselves entirely by way of those problems. I'm a depressed person. Yes, depression is part of what you're experiencing now, but you are actually more than a depressed person. That's part of the identity pie, and there's a whole bunch of other pie there that you might overlook if you define yourself categorically by way of a problem.
Yeah, very good point. You know what I was thinking while I was reading the book? All the examples in the book are of extreme cases of really extreme people who went through imprisonment, solitary confinement, the woman with medical conditions, like severe extreme cases. And I get that growth happens, right? There was that correlation between distress and growth. But how about, I'm more interested in quote unquote normal people, not the extreme cases, but ordinary stories, who were able to cultivate resilience. Why aren't they in the book? That's my number one question. Or is it more compelling to present the case for resiliency on those extreme examples of courage, heroism, and things like that?
In some ways, it is compelling. These are, massive things that have happened to people, being in a POW camp, having a heart transplant, having a personal loss, dealing with a congenital medical problem. All of these things are pretty significant in terms of, how we think about the magnitude of stress. But what our research shows is that those same strategies are also present as people deal with everyday stress. So people dealing with an assignment that they have to do, or they have to deal with a difficult patient interaction, or they're going through a breakup. All of those things, those same strategies that people use in extreme situations, people use in more mild, stressful situations as well. And we actually Drs. Charney and Southwick started their research in resilience by learning from the extreme cases, things that were shown to apply to less extreme cases. So the extreme cases tell us a lot all at once in these condensed and really moving narratives. But those same strategies, they're not unique to those people. And a lot of those people were ordinary people. I would say none of them in the book, they're not superheroes. They're not genetically different in a way that is impossible to emulate. They are many cases of ordinary people, like Carolyn Moore, who we talk about at the end of the book, who lost her husband in a car accident and started the Modern Widows Club. An ordinary person. They're not all military commandos. There are ordinary people who go through extraordinary situations, and we all could go through an extraordinary situation. But many of the skills are used and are very useful in everyday stressors as well.
Could you speak about the role models a little bit? I think that's an interesting one.
So role models are exceptionally important. And I certainly know in my life that two of my greatest role models were my maternal grandfather and my paternal grandfather. My paternal grandfather was a hospital leader, led a small hospital system on Staten Island for a couple of decades, and is one of the most generous and giving people that I know. And I think I learned that generosity from him. And my maternal grandfather was a telephone repair person. And I learned a lot of curiosity from him. I learned how to take things apart and put them back together sometimes. I learned, how to build things, how to push my imagination. I learned that from him. And I think had I not had those role models, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing today, where I'm bringing some of those different attributes together. But I think, especially for parents, it's important to have your own role models for parenting that probably more than a book can provide. So not just a book about parenting in the library, but real people who've been through some stuff to lean on, who've been there, and to get different opinions and to figure out for yourself what makes sense. And to understand that you're a role model to your children. Like, what do you want your child to learn from interactions with you over time? I would hope that means that they learn that you're reliable, that you can regulate your own emotions, that you can help them navigate different successes and failures in their life, that you are consistent. And all of those things are important aspects of parenting and make good role models of parents. And I think one thing that parents are so afraid of, and I should say transparently, I'm not a parent myself, but I often hear this fear of making a mistake and, quote, scarring your child for life. And I think that reflects a outdated understanding of how child development works.
Say more about that. I like the sound of it. So yeah, no, I'm kidding. So of all the 10 factors, if we were to pick the top 3 that are the most important factors, what would they be?
For me, they would be social support, having a network, investing time in that social network every day, so you have it when you really need it. Cognitive flexibility, thinking about your problems flexibly, thinking about different perspectives on the challenges that you face, allowing that defense attorney voice in your mind to actually wake up and do their job, and a little bit of optimism, a little bit of hope that tomorrow can be better and that you have even just a little bit of control over your present situation.
Well, thank you, Jonathan. This was quite illuminating. I enjoyed speaking with you. Is there anything else that I didn't ask that you wanted to convey or say about resilience before we say goodbye?
What I think I would want to say about resilience is that it's a journey. It's not necessarily just the destination. Think about it as a journey, things that you add to your toolbox of life along the way. You're never quite done. It's not like that President Bush photo of mission accomplished in the background after one of the conflicts had wound down. It's never like that. For me, I think about resilience as something you have to invest in, and that there has to be national investment in, but also personal investment in as well. So because there's always going to be stuff that's thrown at you. It's never really mission accomplished.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time here with me. Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener, and I hope you enjoyed it. Did you learn anything new about resilience? What is your biggest takeaway from this conversation? I love hearing from you. I always welcome your feedback, comments, and questions. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And yes, I do prefer audio messages. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website. Go to authenticparenting.com/contact and send me a message. If you want to connect with your fellow listeners from around the world, engage in meaningful conversations about the show, get support and answers to your parenting questions, join the Authentic Parenting community on Facebook, a private support group for parents like you. Show your support. Rate and review the podcast on whatever platform that you listen to. Your ratings and reviews help us get more visibility. If you love the podcast and find it helpful, please consider making a donation today. Go to authenticparenting.com/support and make a contribution. Your support is invaluable. You can find the show and follow it wherever podcasts are played. Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, and elsewhere. And finally, if you want to know what I'm up to in my private life, see behind the scenes of podcasting, get some inspirational content about personal development and parenting, follow me on Instagram, the only social media platform that I use. And as always, connect to the present moment, to yourself and your children. Until next week, I am Anna Seewald. Thank you so much for listening.